I met David in 2018. He was physically unremarkable, white, medium build, brown hair. He had an uncertainty about him that made him seem younger than the 35 years documented in the medical record. I found myself thinking, he won't last. He'll come back to clinic once or twice and I'll never see him again. But I've learned my powers of prognostication are unreliable. I've had patients I was convinced I could help who proved to be intractable, and others I deemed hopeless who were surprisingly resilient. Hence, when seeing new patients now, I try to quiet that doubting voice and remember that everyone's got a shot at recovery. "Tell me what brings you in," I said. David's problems began in college, but more precisely the day he walked into student mental health services. He was a 20-year-old sophomore undergraduate in upstate New York looking for help with anxiety and poor school performance. His anxiety was triggered by interacting with strangers or anyone he didn't know well. His face would flush, his chest and back would get damp, and his thoughts would get jumbled. He avoided classes where he had to speak in front of others. He dropped out of a required speech and communication seminar twice, eventually fulfilling the requirement by taking an equivalent class at community college. "What were you afraid of?" I asked. "I was afraid to fail. I was afraid to be exposed as not knowing. I was afraid to ask for help." After a 45-minute appointment and a pencil and paper test that took less than 5 minutes to complete, he was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, ADD, and generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. The psychologist who administered the test recommended he follow up with a psychiatrist to prescribe an anti-anxiety medication and, David said, a stimulant for my ADD. He was not offered psychotherapy or other non-medication behavioral modification. David went to see a psychiatrist who prescribed Paxil, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, to treat depression and anxiety, and Adderall, a stimulant to treat ADD. "So, how did it go for you? The meds, I mean." "The Paxil helped with the anxiety a little at first. It dampened down some of the worst sweating, but it wasn't a cure. I ended up changing my major from computer engineering to computer science, thinking that would help. It required less interaction. But because I wasn't able to speak up and say I didn't know, I failed an exam. And then I failed the next one, and then I dropped out for a semester not to take a hit on my grade point average. Eventually, I switched out of the School of Engineering altogether, which was really sad because it was what I loved and really wanted to do. I became a history major. The classes were smaller, only 20 people, and I could get away with being less interactive. I could take the blue book home and work by myself." "What about the Adderall?" I asked. "Well, I'd take 10 milligrams first thing every morning before class. It helped me get that deep focus. But looking back, I think I just had bad study habits. Adderall helped me make up for that, but it also helped me procrastinate. If there was a test and I hadn't studied, I'd take Adderall around the clock, all through the day and night to cram for the exam. Then it got to where I couldn't study without it. Then I started needing more." "Was it hard to get more?" I asked. "Not really," he said. "I always knew when a refill was due. I'd call the psychiatrist a few days before, not a lot of days before, just 1 or 2 so they wouldn't get suspicious. Actually, I'd run out like 10 days before, but if I called a few days before, they'd refill it right then. I also learned it was better to talk to the PA, the physician's assistant. They'd be more likely to refill without asking too many questions. Sometimes I'd make up excuses, like say there was a problem with the mail-order pharmacy, but most of the time I didn't have to." "It sounds like the pills weren't really helping." David paused. "In the end, it came down to comfort. It was just easier to take a pill and feel the pain."